Saren knew she was with child 3 days before the letter arrived. That would change everything. She had suspected for a fortnight. The quiet nausea that greeted her each morning, the tenderness in her body that had no other explanation, the way her body had changed in ways she recognized, as though her very being had decided to keep a secret of its own. She had told no one. She had not even told him. She had pressed her palm flat against her stomach each night in the narrow bed of her small room and whispered to the silence, as if the words might somehow reach the life forming beneath her skin. I will find the right moment. I will tell him when the world is still. But the world at Wren Hollow Park was never still. And the moment she had been waiting for was about to be stolen from her. The letter came on a gray morning in late October, delivered by a rider in emerald and gold livery that no one in the household recognized. He was shown into the great hall while the household buzzed with speculation. Within the hour, Lady Delphine Everard had summoned the entire senior staff to the housekeeper's parlor. Saren was not senior staff. She was the seamstress, a position that existed somewhere between the upper servants and the household ghosts. She mended, she altered, she stitched new curtains and repaired old tapestries, and she occupied a small room on the second floor of the east wing that was close enough to the family's quarters to be convenient, but modest enough to be invisible. She heard the news the way invisible people always hear news through the walls. Lady Delphine's voice was built for carrying a clear, commanding instrument that could silence a drawing room at 30 paces. Even through oak paneling and plaster, every word reached Saren's workroom with perfect clarity. The Lady Adeline Harcourt will be arriving at Wren Hollow in a fortnight, accompanied by her mother, the Countess, and a retinue of 6. This visit is of the highest importance. Lady Adeline is among the most eligible young women in England, and His Grace has consented to receive her as a potential match. Every corner of this house will reflect the dignity of the Ashwick name. There will be no lapses. There will be no irregularities. Saren's needle stopped moving. Her hand hovered above the embroidery frame, suspended in midair as though the thread itself had forgotten how to fall. A potential match. She set the needle down very carefully. She placed both hands flat on the table. She breathed. She was the Duke of Wren Hollow's wife. They had been married 3 months ago in the private chapel at Birchfield, a small parish 6 miles from the estate, witnessed by the aging chaplain, Father Oswin, and by the Duke's valet, Renwick, who had served the family for 40 years and whose silence was absolute. The ceremony had been brief and unadorned. There had been no music, no flowers, no guests in silk and satin. There had only been Taryn's voice, low and steady, speaking the vows as though they were an oath of war rather than a promise of love, and her own voice, barely above a whisper, saying the words that had bound her life to his. No one else knew, not the staff, not the tenants, not the county, and most crucially, not Lady Delphine. His aunt controlled the family trust. Until Taryn turned 30 in the spring, she held the purse strings of the entire estate. If she discovered the marriage before then, she had the legal authority and the personal ruthlessness to create a scandal that would consume them both. She could withhold the estate's income. She could challenge the marriage on grounds of improper license. She could make their lives a misery of litigation and social ruin. 6 months, he had said on the evening of their wedding, his hand covering hers. 6 months and I will have full control of the estate. Then we will announce it properly. You will take your rightful place. 6 months had felt endurable then. It felt like a lifetime now. And then came Lady Delphine's final instruction, delivered with the surgical precision of a woman who understood exactly where to place a blade. The seamstress will be moved from the east wing to the attic workroom. Her current quarters are needed for additional staff accommodation during the visit. She will confine her movements to the service areas and will not be present in any room being used by the family or their guests. Saren sat alone in her workroom and stared at the wall. She was being erased, moved to the margins of the house like a piece of furniture that clashed with the new decor, and the entire household would see it. They would understand exactly what it meant. The quiet seamstress who had been granted rooms suspiciously close to the Duke's own quarters was being put back in her place. A distant whinny broke through the silence outside her window, low and calling, the sound of a creature searching for something it could not find. Saren closed her eyes. She knew that sound as well as she knew her own heartbeat. Sovereign was looking for her. The horse was a legend at Wren Hollow, and not a gentle one. Sovereign had belonged to Lord Hadrian Ashwick, the Duke's younger brother, a man whose laughter had once rung through these corridors like church bells. Hadrian had been everything Terran was not. Open where Terran was guarded, reckless where Terran was controlled, warm where Terran was stone. He had loved two things in this world with an unreserved and reckless passion: riding and people. He had died pursuing both, drowning in the River Rill 18 months ago, when he spurred Sovereign into a flooded crossing to reach a tenant's child trapped on the far bank. The child had lived. Hadrian had not. Sovereign had stood on the riverbank and screamed. The groom said the horse had not stopped screaming for 3 days. When they finally coaxed him back to his stall, he had kicked the door to splinters. He had bitten one of the stable boys badly enough to scar. He refused to be ridden, saddled, or even approached by anyone except old Geraint, the head groom, and even Geraint bore the marks of his grief on his forearms. No one went near him willingly. Even the Duke could not bring himself to visit the horse. Sovereign had become what grief always becomes when it has no outlet. He had become dangerous. That was before Saren. She had been at Wren Hollow for only a fortnight when it happened. She had taken a shortcut through the stable yard on her way to the kitchen gardens, her basket over her arm, her mind elsewhere. She had not known about the horse. She had turned at the sound of hooves on packed earth and found him standing 10 feet away on the other side of the fence. 17 hands of black muscle and fury, his mane tangled with burrs, his coat dull from months of neglect. His eyes were dark and wild, rolling white at the edges, and he was staring at her. Every instinct told her to run. She did not move. It was not bravery. It was something she had learned in the years since her father's death. When the world is frightening, when everything around you is loud and violent and out of control, the only power you have is the power to be still, to be quiet, to refuse to add your own fear to the chaos. She stood and she watched him. She breathed slowly. She did not speak. The horse snorted. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, flickered forward. He took a step, then another. He came to the fence and stretched his massive neck over the top rail, and with a sound that was half sigh and half groan, he lowered his great head and rested it against her shoulder. The weight of him nearly buckled her knees. He was warm and solid and trembling, and the sound he made was not the scream the grooms described. It was something quieter, a low, shuddering breath that carried the weight of every day he had spent alone since his master drowned. Old Geraint had found her there 20 minutes later and stopped dead. In all my years, the old groom had said, his voice thick with something between wonder and grief. In all my years, I have never. He had not finished the sentence. Since that day, it had become a ritual, and then Sovereign began to follow her. Small escapes, a gate unlatched, a fence post rotted through. Every time he got free, he found Saren. At the kitchen garden, at the orchard, once standing outside the morning room window, his black head filling the glass like a living portrait. The household staff were terrified. Lady Delphine had ordered the fences reinforced with iron posts and told Saren, in a tone that could have frozen the river itself, that if the horse escaped again, there would be consequences. But the Duke had seen. Taran had been standing at his study window one morning, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, when Sovereign broke free and trotted across the south lawn. He watched the horse come to a halt beside a figure in a gray dress kneeling by the herb beds. She had not flinched. She had simply reached up without looking and placed her hand on the horse's lowered head. It was the most natural gesture he had ever seen, as unconscious as breathing, as intimate as a prayer. That was the moment he saw her, not as a seamstress, as a person whose stillness held a depth he could not fathom, and was suddenly, urgently compelled to understand. Her name was not just Saren the seamstress. Her name was Saren Colwyn, and before she mended curtains in a great house that did not belong to her, she had been the daughter of a man whose name had once been spoken with respect in every drawing room within 50 miles of Wrenhollow. Amrys Colwyn had been a physician, not a fashionable London doctor with a Harley Street practice, but a country physician of the old school. A man who rode through snow and rain to reach a laboring mother in a tenant's cottage. A man who set bones and stitched wounds and brewed his own tinctures from herbs he grew in the garden behind his house in the village of Brynmere. He had served the Ashwick family for over 20 years. He had delivered both of the old Duke's sons. He had attended the Duchess through her final illness. And then, 4 years ago, everything had changed. Lord Percival Everard, Lady Delphine's husband and the old Duke's younger brother, had died suddenly in the night. A seizure, Amrys had recorded. The consequence of years of excessive drink and a constitution weakened by gout. Lady Delphine had not accepted this verdict. Within a week, she had produced a second opinion from a physician in York suggesting an overdose of digitalis. Within 3 months, Amrys Colwyn had been stripped of his reputation, barred from practice and cast out of the village he had served for 2 decades. The evidence had been thin, a bottle of foxglove tincture. Testimony from Lady Delphine's personal maid. The word of a grieving widow against the word of a country doctor with no powerful friends. Amrys Colwyn had died 14 months later, not of disease, but of the slow, corrosive despair that eats a man from the inside when the world has decided he is guilty of a sin he did not commit. Saren had been 19 years old. She had buried him alone in the churchyard at Brynmere because no one from the village had come. After that, she had survived. Seamstress work in Kendal, mending in Penrith. She had carried her father's medical journals everywhere, and in the back of one she had found what she was looking for: detailed clinical notes on Lord Percival documenting a progressive cardiac condition. The foxglove tincture was not poison. It was the very medicine that had been keeping him alive, but the notes alone were not enough. She needed the corresponding treatment log her father had kept at Wrenhollow itself, locked in the estate's medical room. If that log still existed, it would corroborate his journal entry for entry. And so Saren Colwyn had applied for the position of seamstress at Wrenhollow Park, using her real Christian name, but giving her surname as Graves. That had been 7 months ago. She had also, without plan or intention, fallen in love with the Duke. It had happened slowly, the way dawn breaks in winter. She had seen him standing alone in the rain at the edge of the river, where his brother had drowned, his coat soaked through. She had seen him carrying a sick lamb across a frozen field at dawn because the shepherd's boy had come running in tears. She had seen him sitting in the library at midnight, his head in his hands, the estate ledger spread before him like a map of obligations he could never fully discharge, the weight of a world he had never asked for pressing him into the chair. She had seen him speak gently to a nervous kitchen maid who had dropped a tray, waving away her apologies with a quiet kindness that no one else in the household seemed to notice or remember. She had seen the grief in him, a grief so vast and carefully contained that it frightened her, because she recognized it. It was her own grief, wearing a different face. Their first real conversation had been in the stable yard. "You are not afraid of him," Taryn had said. "Because he is not angry," she had replied. "He is sad. They are different things, and they require different responses." He had been silent for a long time. Then he had come back. The next evening and the next, and slowly standing on either side of that paddock gate with the grieving horse between them, they had begun to talk about grief, about silence, about the particular loneliness of carrying a weight that no one else could see. He had married her 6 weeks later. The proposal, if it could be called that, had come on an evening when the first frost had silvered the paddock fence. They had been standing in their usual place, sovereign between them, the sky above them deepening from copper to indigo. Taryn had not knelt. He had not made a speech. He had simply looked at her across the horse's lowered head and said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "I cannot imagine this house without you. I do not want to. Will you stay? Not as a seamstress, as my wife." She had looked at him for a long time. She had thought of her father, of the mission that had brought her here, of the lies she was still carrying. She had thought of all the reasons to refuse, and there were many. And then she had thought of the man standing before her, a man who had been taught by the world to be cold, and by his grief to be silent, and who was offering her the only thing he had left to give. His broken, guarded, extraordinary heart.
"Yes,"
she had said, and the word had felt like the first honest thing she had spoken since she arrived at Wrenhollow. And now she was carrying his child, a secret within a secret. If her cover was blown before she found the treatment log, the evidence might be destroyed forever. So Saren kept her silence, but the letter had arrived. Lady Adeline was coming, and the world was not still. The move to the attic was carried out the following morning with a brisk, humiliating efficiency. The attic workroom was a long, low-ceilinged room with exposed beams, a small north-facing window that made fine needlework a torment, and a rusted fireplace. Saren set her father's portrait on the windowsill where it would catch whatever light the day could offer, and she began to work. That afternoon, Lady Delphine summoned her. "You have been at Wrenhollow for some months now. I have noticed a tendency toward a certain presumption. The horse, the gardens, your presence in parts of the house where a seamstress has no business. Small things, left unchecked, become large problems. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Saren understood perfectly. Lady Delphine was not merely relocating her. She was establishing a boundary, drawing a line between the seamstress and the Duke. That evening, Sovereign escaped again, but he did not know. She had been moved. Saren watched from the attic window as he stood beneath her former room calling for her. He whinnied, low and questioning. The sound rose through the cold autumn air and reached her 3 stories above, muffled by glass and stone, but unmistakable. He waited. 1 minute, 2, 3. His tail switched, his hooves shifted on the gravel. He whinnied again, louder this time, a note of confusion entering the sound. Where was she? Why was she not where she was supposed to be? The sound carried all the bewilderment of a creature whose one point of stability had been suddenly, inexplicably removed. "Go back," she whispered against the cold glass. He did not go back. He stood and called until old Geraint came with a halter rope and led him away, the horse resisting every step, his dark eyes searching the windows for a face that was no longer there. And from his study below, Taran watched it all. He felt the full weight of what his silence had permitted. He had married this woman. He had spoken vows before God. And now he was watching her be diminished, pushed to the margins of her own home, while he stood behind glass and said nothing. He thought of Hadrian. His brother would have called him a coward, but Hadrian was dead. That, and Taran was the one left, holding together a world that was slowly coming apart. The fortnight before Lady Adeline's arrival was a siege. Lady Delphine conducted it with the precision of a military campaign. Every room was inspected. Every surface was polished, every arrangement of flowers, every placement of cushion, every fold of curtain was adjusted and readjusted until it met her exacting standards. The staff moved through the house in a state of exhausted tension, their faces drawn, their movements quick and nervous, like animals aware of a predator in the tall grass. Saren bore the heaviest burden. The sewing demands were relentless. Saren worked from dawn until past midnight, her fingers moving by candlelight. The nausea intensified. She learned to keep a basin beside her work table. She ate what she could, which was less each day. The meals sent up to the attic were meager, and her appetite had been stolen by the relentless queasiness that was the price of the life growing inside her. The household staff treated her with a distance that hardened into something colder. Only old Geraint showed her kindness, appearing at the attic door one evening with a bundle of apples. "Good for the stomach," he said gruffly. and left before she could thank him. And Taran did not come. She had expected him. She had listened for his footstep on the stairs. He did not come. 3 days, 5, a week. Once, descending the back stairs, she caught a glimpse of him at the end of a corridor. Their eyes met. Then Lady Delphine's voice called from the drawing room, and he turned away. Saren stood in the corridor and felt something crack inside her. Not break, not yet, but crack, like the first fracture in a frozen lake. The cruelest blow came 4 days before Lady Adeline's arrival. Passing through the corridor behind the breakfast room, Saren heard Lady Delphine speaking to Cressley. The seamstress. When the visit concludes, I see no reason to retain her. A village seamstress can be engaged by the day. It is more efficient and less complicated. She was going to be dismissed. After the visit, after she had sewn every gown and hemmed every curtain and embroidered every napkin, she would be turned out. Her access to the house, to the medical room, to the records that could clear her father's name would end, and Lady Delphine would have achieved what she wanted without ever raising a hand. The seamstress would simply disappear, as quietly and completely as Emrys Colwyn had disappeared before her. That night, lying on the narrow attic bed, Saren made her calculations. She had 4 days before the guests arrived. Once they were here, the house would be crawling with unfamiliar staff. Movement would be scrutinized. The medical room would be even harder to reach. She had to act now. Before the visit. Before the dismissal. Before the last door closed. She pressed her hand to her stomach and whispered to the darkness, "Forgive me. I have to try." Taran's mother arrived unannounced on a Tuesday. The Dowager Duchess of Wrenhollow, Lady Jessamine Ashwick, was a woman who viewed formal invitations as a courtesy extended by lesser people. She arrived in her own carriage, accompanied by her ancient spaniel, and received Lady Delphine with the brittle civility of opposing generals meeting under a flag of truce. "Leave us," the Dowager told Lady Delphine after Taran was seated. "I wish to speak with my son privately." "Delphine." The Dowager's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "This is my house. My son is the Duke. You are his aunt by marriage. I am grateful for your years of service, but I did not ask for your opinion. I asked you to leave." The silence that followed was a battle in itself. Lady Delphine held the Dowager's gaze for a long, taut moment. Then she inclined her head, the barest possible nod of compliance, and left the room. The door closed behind her with a soft, precise click. The Dowager watched it close. Then she turned to her son. "Now, tell me about the seamstress." "Geraint writes to me. He told me about the horse. He told me about the girl. And he told me that Delphine has exiled her to the attic, while you sit in your study and pretend nothing is happening. I also received a visit from Father Oswin last month. He remembers a ceremony in his chapel, a marriage, witnessed by Renwick. Were you going to tell me, or were you going to let your aunt parade Lady Adeline through this house and propose a match with a man who is already wed?" The mask fell from Taran's face. "I was going to tell you. When the time was right, when I had control of the estate, when is always the refuge of men who are afraid to act. You are so like your father. He waited to intervene when Delphine destroyed that physician. He waited to make peace with Hadrian after their quarrel. And then he died, and all his waiting amounted to nothing." She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "Do not make his mistakes, Taran. The world does not wait for you to be ready. It moves, and it takes things from you. And the things it takes cannot be recovered by careful planning. You do not understand the legal complexities," he said, but the words had no force. "I understand that there is a woman in your attic who is being punished for the crime of being loved by you," the Dowager said. "And I understand that the horse knows it, and Geraint knows it, and I know it, and the only person who refuses to see it is you. What is her name? Her real name?" "Saren Colwyn." The Dowager's expression changed. "Colwyn, as in Emrys Colwyn. The physician Delphine accused of poisoning her husband. He did not poison anyone," Taran said. and for the first time there was heat in his voice. "Saren has proof. Her father's journals. But she needs the corroborating records from the estate's medical room, and Delphine has kept it locked since the day she dismissed him." The dowager's eyes filled with tears. That poor, brave girl. She came into this house alone, into the house of the woman who destroyed her father, and you have wrapped her in secrecy and called it protection. Tell me, Taran, what is the difference between protecting someone and imprisoning them? He had no answer. "I need to speak with her," he said. "You need to choose. Between your fear of Delphine and your duty to your wife, between the safe path and the just one. Your brother would not have hesitated." "My brother is dead because he did not hesitate," Taran said. "Your brother is dead because he was brave," the dowager replied. "And the child he saved is alive because of it. Hesitation does not make you wise, Taran. It makes you complicit." She stood. "Find your wife. Tell her she is not alone. And for heaven's sake, do something about that horse. The sound of his calling breaks my heart." She left. Taran sat in the empty drawing room and stared at the fire. Complicit, imprisoned, afraid. His mother's words circled in his mind like birds of prey, each one finding its mark with unerring accuracy. She had always had that gift, the ability to reduce a complicated situation to its simplest, most devastating truth. He had been afraid. He was still afraid. But fear, he was beginning to understand, was not an excuse. It was a choice. And he had been choosing it every day, every hour, every time he looked away from the attic stairs and returned to his desk. He stood. He crossed the great hall. He reached the service staircase. He put his hand on the banister. "Your Grace," Cressley's voice came from behind him. "Lady Delphine requests your presence in the library. She says it concerns the arrangements for Lady Ottoline, and cannot wait." Taran stood with his hand on the banister, one foot on the first step, suspended between the woman above him and the woman below. The moment held. The house waited. He released the banister. He turned and walked toward the library. And 3 floors above, Saren stood at the top of the staircase in the shadows, where she had been descending to find him. She had heard his footsteps approaching. She had heard him stop. She had heard him turn away. She pressed her back against the cold wall and closed her eyes. She placed one hand against the rough plaster and the other against her stomach, and she breathed. And she did not cry, because tears were exactly what people like Lady Delphine wanted. She had learned that lesson as a girl, standing in her father's empty study after the bailiffs had come and gone. Tears were currency in the economy of cruelty. They bought nothing and cost everything. She would not spend them here. But for the first time since she had come to Wren Hollow, she was not sure that breathing would be enough. 3 nights before Lady Ottoline's arrival, Saren made her move. She rose an hour past midnight, wrapped her dark shawl around her shoulders, and descended the service staircase by feel. 3 flights down. Through the service corridor, past the kitchen, past the butler's pantry. The medical room was at the end of a short passage, locked with a simple iron mechanism she had studied for weeks. She had fashioned a tool from a broken embroidery needle, bent and flattened with patient work over several evenings. She inserted it. The metal scraped against the lock's internal mechanism, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. She adjusted the angle. She pressed. Something inside resisted, then shifted, then clicked. The door opened. The smell hit her first. Old medicine, dust. The faint, lingering ghost of camphor and dried herbs. It was the smell of her father's coat. The smell of his study. The smell of the life that had been taken from them both. She pressed her hand to her mouth and breathed through it. She stepped inside and pulled the door almost shut behind her. The room was small. She could feel the dimensions of it in the darkness, the close walls, the low ceiling. Her hands found a shelf. Bottles still stoppered. Jars with labels she could not read. A metal tray. She moved along the shelf, searching by touch. Her father had kept his treatment logs in bound ledgers, one for each year of service. They would be heavy, leather-covered, with his initials stamped on the spine. Her fingers moved over glass, over wood, over the cold curve of a pestle. Then they found leather, thick, cracked, familiar. She pulled the ledger from the shelf. She had brought 2 matches tucked into the fold of her shawl. She struck the first against the rough edge of the shelf. Orange light filled the small room. Her father's bottles still lined the shelves. His mortar and pestle sat on the work table. A framed certificate of practice hung on the wall, its glass dusty, its text still legible. Emrys Colwyn, licensed physician. It was as though time had stopped the day he was cast out, and no one had thought to clear away the evidence of his existence. She found the entries for Lord Percival Everard. Every consultation, every symptom, every dose of foxglove tincture, precisely recorded. The picture was exactly as her father's private journal described. A man with a failing heart, managed with skill and care, whose death had been the inevitable conclusion of a long decline. The first match burned her fingers and she dropped it. She struck the second and final match. The flame held long enough to confirm what she needed. The match burned out. She clutched the ledger to her chest. She had it. The proof, the corroboration, everything she needed to clear her father's name. She turned for the door and stopped. Voices, faint but unmistakable, coming from the corridor near the butler's pantry. 2 voices. One she recognized instantly, the low, measured tones of her husband. The other took a moment longer. Lady Delphine. Saren pressed herself against the wall of the medical room, the ledger clutched against her chest. The door was ajar by 2 inches. The voices were growing clearer, carried by the stone walls of the corridor. You cannot be serious, Taryn. The girl is a seamstress, a nobody. The entire county will be watching this visit. Lady Ottoline is the daughter of an earl. Her family has connections to the crown itself. This match would secure the Ashwick name for a generation. I am aware of the political advantages, then act on them. You have been drifting. Since Hadrian died, you have retreated into yourself. The estate needs leadership. It needs an alliance. It needs an heir. And you need a wife of appropriate standing, not a seamstress who attracts your dead brother's horse. Saren stopped breathing. The seamstress, Taryn said, and there was something in his voice, a careful, deliberate flatness that Saren had never heard before. The seamstress is not a concern. She is nothing, a servant. I have no attachment to her. The words hit her like a physical blow. She pressed the ledger harder against her chest as though it could shield her. Good, Lady Delphine said. Then you will have no objection to her dismissal after the visit. None. And you will receive Lady Ottoline with the seriousness the occasion demands. I will do what is necessary for the future of this estate. Saren heard Lady Delphine's footsteps retreating down the corridor, the sharp click of her heels on the stone floor. She heard Taryn's breathing, a single long exhale, and then his footsteps too, moving in the opposite direction, back toward the main house. Then there was nothing. Only the darkness and the smell of old medicine and the ledger in her arms, and the child in her body and the words that were still echoing in her skull, bouncing off the walls of her mind like a stone thrown into a well, falling and never reaching the bottom. She is nothing. A servant. I have no attachment to her. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Saren did not move for a long time. She stood in the darkness of her father's old dispensary, the ledger pressed to her chest, and let the words settle into her like stones sinking into deep water. She is nothing. A servant. I have no attachment to her. She understood, in the rational part of her mind, that he might have been lying, that he might have been deflecting Lady Delphine's suspicions, playing the same careful game of concealment they had both agreed to play. She understood that the Taryn she knew, the man who had held her hands in a cold chapel and spoken vows with the gravity of a man swearing a blood oath, might have been protecting her by denying her. But understanding and believing were not the same thing, because the words had not sounded like a performance. They had sounded like relief, like a man setting down a weight he was tired of carrying. She thought of the past weeks, the exile to the attic, the silence, the empty staircase, where his footsteps had approached and turned away. He had not protested. He had not intervened. He had simply permitted it, step by step, as though watching her disappear was merely the cost of his strategy. And now, in the darkness, speaking to the woman who controlled his fortune, he had called her nothing. Perhaps he meant it. Perhaps the marriage had been an impulse, a moment of grief-driven recklessness that he now regretted. Perhaps the careful, methodical Duke of Renhollow had looked at the balance sheet of his life and decided that a seamstress on one side could not outweigh an earl's daughter on the other. She made her decision, standing in the room where her father had once worked, surrounded by the instruments of his healing, holding the proof of his innocence against the place where his grandchild was growing. The irony of it was almost unbearable. She was standing in the intersection of everything she had lost and everything she had found, and the man who connected them all had just called her nothing. She would not confront him. She would not weep. She would not beg for an explanation. She would do what she had always done. She would rely on herself. She had the ledger. She had her father's journals. She had the proof she had come for. The original mission, the mission that had brought her to Renhollow long before love had complicated everything, was complete. She could take her evidence to a magistrate. She could clear her father's name. She could do it alone, without the Duke, without the protection of a marriage that might exist only on paper. She slipped out of the medical room, closed the door, and climbed the stairs to her attic. She packed her bag in the darkness. She placed the ledger and her father's journals at the bottom, wrapped in a petticoat. She placed her father's portrait on top. She left the sewing, the thread, the shears. They belonged to Renhollow. She did not. She would leave at dawn, before the household woke. She would walk to Brynmere. She would find old Mr. Cathcart, the solicitor her father had once trusted. She would present the evidence and begin the process of restoring her father's name. And she would never set foot in this house again. She sat on the edge of the bed, her packed bag beside her, her hands folded in her lap, and did not sleep. The attic was silent around her. The old timbers settling in the cold, the mice in the walls going about their nighttime business with a cheerful indifference to the human dramas unfolding above and below them. She watched the window and waited for the first gray light of morning to release her from the last place she had ever expected to call home. She did not get the chance to leave. At 5 in the morning, a full hour before the household's usual rising time, a sharp knock came at the attic door. Saren barely had time to push her packed bag under the bed before the door opened. It was Cressley. The butler's face was rigid with a formality that was, even by his standards, extreme. "Lady Delphine requires your presence in the library immediately," he said. "You are to bring nothing with you." The library? Not the morning room, where household matters were normally addressed. The Duke's private domain. Something was very wrong. Saren followed Cressley down the stairs, her heart hammering. The library doors were open. The room was lit by gray morning light. The fire had not yet been laid. The room was cold. Lady Delphine was standing behind the Duke's desk. She was holding something. It took Saren a moment to recognize it. When she did, the blood drained from her face. It was her father's journal. The private journal she had kept hidden in her room, wrapped in cloth, tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Lady Delphine had searched her room. "Can you explain this?" Lady Delphine asked. Her voice was calm, but beneath the calm was a vibration of something far more dangerous. She opened the journal and read aloud. "Clinical notes on Lord Percival Everard, written in the hand of Emery's Colwyn. Dosages of foxglove tincture." She looked up. "You are Colwyn's daughter." It was not a question. Saren said nothing. "You came into this house under a false name," Lady Delphine said. "You have been living among us, eating our food, using our resources, all to pursue your dead father's grievance. I should have seen it. The resemblance is there, around the eyes. He had the same stubbornness. My father was innocent," Saren said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. "He did not poison Lord Percival. The matter was settled 4 years ago. The matter was never settled. It was buried. There is a difference." Lady Delphine's eyes narrowed. The calm facade cracked, and beneath it, Saren glimpsed something unexpected. Not anger. Fear. "Where is the treatment ledger?" Lady Delphine asked, her voice sharp now. "The one your father kept here. Where is it?" Saren understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt like cold water against her skin. Lady Delphine had known about the ledger all along. She had left it locked in the medical room for 4 years, not because she had forgotten it, but because she had been afraid to destroy it. Destroying medical records of a dead peer would be a crime. Leaving them untouched and inaccessible was merely negligence. "I do not have it," Saren lied. "My father's journal is all I have." "It does not matter," Lady Delphine said, but the relief in her voice was thin and unconvincing. "You are dismissed. You will leave Wrenhollow today. If you attempt to make trouble, if you take this pathetic journal to a magistrate, I will ensure you are charged with fraud, with trespass. The name Colwyn will be dragged through the mud again, and this time there will be no recovery." She picked up the journal and held it over the cold fireplace. "This is going into the first fire lit this morning. Your father's delusions will die with his reputation." The library door opened. Taran walked in. He was dressed in his outdoor coat, his boots muddy, his hair disheveled by the wind. He had been out early on the estate, as he often did when sleep eluded him. He stopped when he saw the scene before him, his wife, pale and rigid, standing before the desk, his aunt, holding a leather journal over the fireplace, the air between them charged with a hostility so intense it was almost visible. "What is happening here?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but the authority in it was absolute. Lady Delphine recovered quickly. She had been managing men for decades, and her instinct for narrative control was as sharp as ever. "Your seamstress is a fraud," she said, her voice ringing with righteous indignation. "Her name is not Graves. She is the daughter of Emrys Colwyn, the physician who poisoned my husband. She has been living in this house under a false identity. I have found this journal in her room. It is filled with her father's ravings. I want her gone today. Arrested, if possible. She is a danger to this household." Taran took the journal. He looked at it. He looked at Lady Delphine. Then he looked at Saren. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Saren searched his face for the man she had married, for the man who had spoken vows in a cold chapel, for the man who had called her nothing in a dark corridor only hours ago. What she saw stopped her breath. She had braced herself for the cold mask, for the careful, calculated expression of a man who had already weighed her value and found it wanting. She had prepared herself for the Duke of Wrenhollow, the man who managed his world like a ledger, balancing assets against liabilities with ruthless precision. She had prepared herself for the man who had called her nothing. What she saw was not that man. His eyes were not cold. They were not guarded. They were blazing with a fury so controlled, so carefully contained, that it was more frightening than any shout or curse could have been. And the fury was not directed at her. He turned to Lady Delphine. "Leave us," he said. "Taran, this woman, leave us." The single word cracked through the room like a whip. Lady Delphine's mouth snapped shut. She stared at her nephew for a long, disbelieving moment, then turned and walked out of the library. The door closed behind her. The silence that followed was vast. It filled the room the way water fills a vessel, pressing into every corner, every shadow, every space between the books on the shelves. Saren could hear the tick of the mantel clock, the distant whinny of Sovereign in the paddock, the soft crackle of the fire that someone had laid while she was being summoned. The sounds of a house that did not yet know its world was about to change. Taran set the journal on the desk. He stood on one side. Saren stood on the other. The distance between them was 6 feet of polished oak, but it felt like an ocean. "You heard me last night," he said. It was not a question. Saren nodded. "You heard what I said to her about you." "Yes," Saren whispered. Taran closed his eyes. When he opened them, the controlled fury was still there, but beneath it was something raw, something that looked like anguish. "I lied," he said. His voice was low, stripped to its foundations. I lied to her because I was afraid. Because I have been afraid since the day I married you. Afraid of what she would do. Afraid of what I would lose. Afraid of everything except the one thing I should have been afraid of. Losing you. Saren felt her composure waver. The wall she had built through the long night, the cold resolve, the decision to leave began to crack. He came around the desk. He did not touch her. He stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the smell of wind and wet earth on his coat. My mother came to me, he said. She told me I was a coward. She was right. I have hidden you. I have allowed my aunt to torment you. I have put strategy ahead of justice and called it wisdom. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. This arrived 3 days ago from my solicitor. He unfolded it. The trust agreement contained a clause that Lady Delphine's own husband had inserted 30 years ago, stipulating that the trustee's authority would be automatically revoked in the event of proven malfeasance. I was waiting for this, Taryn said. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so uncharacteristically vulnerable that it made him look 10 years younger. This is why I held back. This is why I endured the silence and the secrecy. Because without this clause confronting her would have been a declaration of war I could not win. With it I can end her authority in a single stroke. But I needed proof of her malfeasance. I needed evidence that she had acted fraudulently against someone connected to this household. He looked at the journal on the desk. Your father's case is that proof. If his treatment records show that Lord Percival died of natural causes, and that the inquiry was based on fabricated testimony, then Lady Delphine's accusation was itself an act of fraud. Fraud committed while she was trustee. Fraud that destroyed an innocent man's life. You knew, Saren said. You knew who I was. You knew about my father. I knew, he said. Not at first. At first I knew only that you were extraordinary. That you had a stillness in you that my brother's horse recognized before any human did. But after we married, after you told me about the medical records, I began to investigate. Quietly. Through my solicitor. Through my mother's contacts. I have known for 2 months, and I have been building the legal case to bring your aunt down and clear your father's name at the same time. Every letter I have written, every meeting with the solicitor, every sleepless night at my desk has been about this. About you. About making it right. But I was so consumed with building the perfect case, with controlling every piece of the board, that I forgot the most important thing. I forgot that you were not a piece on the board, you were the reason for the game. And while I was strategizing, you were suffering. Then why did you not tell me? The words came out before she could stop them, and they carried 2 months of loneliness and fear in their wake. Because I was afraid, he said again, and his voice cracked on the word. Because I thought that if I controlled every variable, if I waited for the perfect moment, I could protect you from all of it, from Delphine, from the scandal, from the pain of reliving your father's destruction. I thought secrecy was a shield. He stopped. His jaw tightened. My mother told me it was a cage. She was right about that, too. Saren looked at him. She looked at the journal on the desk. She looked at the legal document in his hand. She thought of the attic, of the silence of his footsteps turning away on the staircase. She thought of the words she had heard in the darkness. You called me nothing, she said. Her voice was steady, but barely. I called you nothing to a woman who would have destroyed you if she knew the truth, he said. And every word of it was a lie that tasted like poison in my mouth. You are not nothing, Saren. You are everything. You are my wife. You are the mother of my. He stopped. He looked at her. Something in her face, some involuntary flicker had betrayed her. The silence between them changed. It became something else entirely, charged and fragile and immense. Saren, he said. His voice was barely audible. Are you? She placed her hand on her stomach. The gesture was enough. Taran Ashwick, the 7th Duke of Wrenhollow, a man who had faced down creditors and storms, and the drowning grief of his brother's death without flinching, sat down in the nearest chair, as though his legs had simply ceased to function. He stared at her. His dark eyes were wide. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then he dropped his head into his hands, and his shoulders shook, and Saren realized that the sound coming from him was not grief. It was a laugh. A broken, incredulous, overwhelmed laugh that was half sob and half prayer. "A child," he said into his hands. "A child. Good heavens, a child." He looked up at her. His face was wet. He was smiling. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face, and it transformed him so completely that for a moment he looked like a different man, a younger man, a man who had not yet learned to carry the world on his shoulders. "Come here," he said. His voice was rough. "Please, come here." She did not move immediately. She stood on the other side of the desk and looked at him. This man who had hidden her and hurt her and lied for her and loved her, all at the same time, all with the same fierce, clumsy, insufficient devotion. She looked at his wet face and his shaking hands, and the smile that had cracked open his granite features like sunlight through storm clouds. And she thought, this is the father of my child, this imperfect, terrified, beautiful man. She went to him. He took her hands. He pressed them to his lips. Then he stood, and he held her, carefully, as though she were made of glass and prayer, and everything he had ever been afraid to want. The reckoning came that afternoon. Taran did not wait. The careful, methodical Duke, who had spent months constructing a perfect legal strategy, abandoned his timeline in a single morning. The discovery of the child had detonated something in him, a charge that had been building for months beneath his rigid self-control. He was done waiting. He was done calculating. He was done being afraid. He sent Renwick to fetch the ledger from the attic, where Saren had hidden it beneath the loose floorboard, after returning from the medical room. He sent his fastest rider to Brynmere with a letter for Mr. Gann, Cathcart requesting his immediate presence at Wrenhollow. He sent a second letter to the magistrate of the district, informing him that new evidence had come to light in the matter of the late Dr. Emrys Colwyn. Then he sent for his mother. The dowager arrived in the library with her spaniel and her knitting, and a look of sharp, expectant satisfaction. "You have that look," she said, the one Hadrian used to get when he had made up his mind. "Good. It suits you better than the other one." He told her everything. The overheard conversation, Saren's midnight search, the ledger, the journal, the legal clause, the child. The dowager listened without interruption. When he finished, she set down her knitting. Her eyes were bright. "A grandchild," she said. "Well, that settles it entirely. What do you need from me? I need you in the room when I confront Delphine. I need a witness. And I need you to be the person who tells Saren's story if I am too angry to tell it justly." The dowager nodded. "You have been a fool," she said conversationally. "But you are choosing to stop being one, and that is all anyone can ask." Cathcart arrived at 3 in the afternoon. He was a small, precise man in his 70s, with spectacles that seemed too large for his face and a memory as sharp and ordered as a filing cabinet. Taran received him in the library and placed both the journal and the ledger before him. The old solicitor read in silence for 40 minutes. "This is conclusive," he said. "The treatment records corroborate the journal entry for entry. Lord Percival's condition was degenerative and terminal. The foxglove was prescribed in appropriate therapeutic doses. Dr. Colwyn's treatment was exemplary. There is no evidence of poisoning, none whatsoever. The inquiry that destroyed this man's reputation was based on a single uncorroborated testimony, and a second opinion from a physician since exposed for providing favorable medical opinions for payment. In my professional judgment, this constitutes malicious prosecution, and the trust clause. If Lady Delphine's accusation can be proven fraudulent, her actions constitute malfeasance during her tenure as trustee. The clause is unambiguous. Her authority would be automatically and irrevocably revoked. "Send for Lady Delphine," Taran said to Renwick, "and bring my wife." The library had never been so quiet. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, catching the dust motes that drifted in the still air. The fire had been laid and lit, casting a warm glow across the rug where Sovereign had once lain at Saren's feet during her dusting days, though none of them thought of that now. The room smelled of leather and beeswax, and the faint, clean scent of autumn that drifted through a window left ajar. It was the smell of Taryn's world, and today it would be the setting for its transformation. Lady Delphine entered first. She was dressed as though for battle, her gray silk immaculate, her face a mask of composed authority. She stopped when she saw the Dowager by the fire. She stopped again when she saw Mr. Cathcart by the window, with papers in his hands. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Sit down, Delphine," the Dowager said. Her tone held no warmth and no malice. It was simply the voice of a woman who had seen enough and was ready for the truth. Lady Delphine did not sit. Then the door opened, and Saren walked in. She was not wearing her gray servant's dress. The Dowager had sent her own maid to the attic an hour earlier, with a gown of deep blue wool, simply cut but unmistakably fine. Saren's dark hair was unpinned, falling over her shoulders. She walked into the room with her hands at her sides and her eyes clear, and for the first time in all these months, she did not look like a seamstress. She looked like exactly what she was. The Duchess of Wrenhollow. Sovereign's distant whinny, carried from the paddock, muted by the glass, but audible to everyone in the room. The horse knew. He always knew. Taryn spoke. "4 years ago, you accused Dr. Emrys Colwyn of poisoning your husband," he said. His voice was controlled, quiet, and absolutely without mercy. "You brought a fraudulent second opinion from a physician who has since been struck off. You suborned testimony from your personal maid. You presented this fabricated case to a magistrate, and you destroyed an innocent man's life." Lady Delphine drew breath to speak. Taran raised his hand. "I have not finished." He picked up the ledger. "This is the treatment log Dr. Colwyn kept in this house for 20 years. It documents, in meticulous clinical detail, that Lord Percival suffered from a progressive and terminal weakness of the heart. The foxglove tincture was his treatment. It was the medicine keeping him alive. You knew this. You lived with the man, and when he died, you chose to use his death as a weapon against the man who had tried to save him." "Mr. Ninka." Cathcart stepped forward. He spoke for 5 minutes. He outlined the evidence. He cited the trust clause. He stated his professional conclusion in language that was dry, precise, and utterly devastating. When he finished, the room was silent. Taryn walked out from behind his desk. He crossed the room and stood beside Saren. He took her hand. The gesture was simple, public, and unmistakable. "This is my wife," he said. His voice was thick with an emotion that he did not try to hide. "Her name is Saren Colwyn Ashwick, Duchess of Wrenhollow. We were married 3 months ago by Father Oswin, witnessed by Renwick. She came into this house to find the proof that would clear her father's name, and she found it. She also found me, which is more than I deserved." He looked at Lady Delphine. "You persecuted her," he said. His voice was low and cutting, each word placed with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "You moved her to the attic. You assigned her work that would have broken a woman twice her strength. You isolated her from every kindness in this household. You starved her of company and rest and dignity. You planned her dismissal the moment she ceased to be useful to you. You searched her room like a common thief, and you tried to destroy the only evidence of her father's innocence. You did all of this, Delphine. Every cruelty, every indignity, every calculated humiliation you inflicted upon a woman who was carrying the future heir of this estate." The last sentence landed like a stone in still water. Its ripples spread across the room in silence. Lady Delphine's composure broke. It did not shatter dramatically. It simply collapsed, the way a wall collapses when the last supporting stone is removed. Her shoulders curved inward. Her chin dropped. "He was dying," she whispered. Her voice was hollow, stripped of all pretense. "Percival was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do. I could not bear it. I could not bear the helplessness. And when he died, I needed someone to blame. I needed it to mean something. I needed it to not be just the end. She looked at Saren. Your father was a good man. I knew it then. I know it now. I destroyed him because I could not destroy the thing that had taken my husband, and I have lived with that knowledge every day since. She straightened. A ghost of her old composure returned, just enough to hold her upright. She looked around the room, at the faces arrayed against her, at the papers that had undone her, at the young woman in blue who stood beside the Duke with the quiet, unbreakable dignity that was, Delphine realized, the very quality she had most feared and most despised. It was the quality of a person who does not need power to know their own worth. What will you do with me? Taran looked at Saren. He did not answer for her. He waited. Saren looked at the woman who had ruined her father, who had cast her out of her life, who had exiled her to an attic and planned her dismissal and tried to burn the last record of her father's innocence. She thought of the physician who had ridden through snow to reach a laboring mother, who had set bones and stitched wounds without asking whether the patient could pay. She thought of his hands steady and gentle and his voice always calm, even at the end, even when the world had taken everything from him. He would not have wanted vengeance. He had never wanted vengeance, even at the end, even when the world had stripped him of everything. He had not spoken a single bitter word against the woman who had destroyed him. He had simply said, one evening near the end, when the light in his study was failing and his hands were too weak to hold the pen he had once used to write prescriptions, the truth will come out. Saren, it always does. You must simply be patient enough to outlast the lie. He had wanted the truth, and now she had it. My father's name will be restored, Saren said. Her voice was steady. The inquiry will be formally overturned. A public notice will be placed in every paper that carried the original accusation. His grave in Brynmere will receive a proper stone with his name and his title and the years of his service. She paused. Beyond that, what happens to you is not my concern. You will have to live with what you have done. That is punishment enough. The Dowager was the one who handled the practicalities. Lady Delphine was escorted to her rooms. Her belongings were packed by evening. A carriage took her to a property the Ashwick family owned on the coast, a small, remote house on a cliff above the sea, where the wind was constant and the nearest village was 3 miles of rough track away. She would have a housekeeper and a small income. She would have her life. She would not have her power, her position, or the family whose name she had traded on for 40 years. The letter to Lady Audeline's family was written that evening. Taran composed it himself, sitting at the desk where so many of the house's decisions had been made and unmade over the generations. It was a gracious, regretful withdrawal. He chose each word with the same care he had once reserved for estate accounts and legal briefs, but this time the precision served a different purpose. It served the truth. Mr. Cathcart departed for Brynmere with the ledger and the journal, and a detailed brief for the magistrate. The formal process of overturning the inquiry into Dr. Emery's Colwyn would begin within the week. And then, at last, the house was quiet. Taran found Saren in the stable yard at dusk. She was standing at the paddock fence, Sovereign's head resting on her shoulder, her hand on his neck. The horse's eyes were half closed. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. He was at peace. He was where he belonged. Taran walked over and stood beside her. He did not speak for a long time. He simply stood watching the horse and the woman, the two creatures in this world who had taught him what courage looked like when it wore no armor. The sky above them was the color of bruised plums, and the first stars were beginning to appear faint and uncertain, like promises made in a whisper. He simply stood, watching the horse and the woman, the two creatures in this world who had taught him what courage looked like when it wore no armor. I failed you, he said finally. Yes, Saren said. She did not soften the word. She did not look at him. I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself the secrecy was necessary. I told myself that waiting was wisdom. It was fear, Saren said. You hid me because you were afraid of what it would cost you to claim me. And I let you, because I was afraid of what it would cost me to demand it. The honesty of it sat between them, unadorned and complete. Neither of them tried to wrap it in gentler language. Your mother told you to choose between the safe path and the just one, Saren said. You chose safe. Every time. Until today, you chose safe. Why today? Because I heard that you were leaving. Because Renwick found your packed bag under the attic bed and brought it to me. And when I opened it and saw your father's portrait wrapped in a petticoat, I understood what I had done. I had driven you to the point where leaving was less painful than staying. And then, when Delphine told me you were Colwyn's daughter, I realized that the woman I had married was braver than I had ever been. She had walked into the house of her enemy with nothing but a dead man's journal, and the belief that the truth was worth more than safety. And I had answered that bravery by hiding her in an attic and calling her nothing to the woman who had destroyed her family. His voice was raw. When I walked into that library this morning and saw her holding your father's journal over the fireplace, I understood what my mother had been trying to tell me. Hesitation is not caution. It is complicity. And I was complicit in your suffering because I was too afraid to end it. Sovereign lifted his head from Saren's shoulder and turned to look at Taran. The horse's dark eyes were steady, measuring. He had never allowed the Duke to touch him. Not once in 18 months he had tolerated Geraint. He had loved Saren, but Taran had been a stranger to him, a man who represented the world that had continued to turn after his master had drowned. Taran raised his hand slowly. He held it out, palm up, and waited. The horse looked at him, snorted, shook his mane. Then, with a deliberation that felt almost ceremonial, Sovereign stretched his neck forward and pressed his nose into Taran's open palm. The warmth of it, the velvet softness, the trust in the gesture, undid something in Taran that all the words in the world could not have reached. Saren watched the horse accept the man she had married, and she felt something loosen in her chest, a knot that had been tightening for months. Sovereign had always been the truest judge in the house. He had recognized her worth before any human being had thought to look. And now he was extending the same grace to Taran, not because the Duke had earned it through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but because the horse could feel what Saren herself was only beginning to accept, that Taran's remorse was real, that his love, however imperfectly expressed, however badly protected, was genuine. He let out a breath that shuddered through his entire body, and when he spoke again his voice was different, quieter, humbler, stripped of every pretense. I do not deserve you, he said. Either of you. He looked at Saren. But if you will let me, I will spend the rest of my life trying to become the man you believed I was when you married me. Saren looked at his hand on the horse's nose. She looked at his face, wet with tears he was not trying to hide. She looked at the great house behind them, its windows catching the last of the autumn light, and she thought of her father who had served this house with devotion and been repaid with ruin. But she also thought of a chapel in winter, and vows spoken like an oath of war. And she thought of the child. She reached out and placed her hand over his, on the horse's nose. Then stop trying, she said, and simply be him. He looked at her. The last of the daylight was fading around them, and in the gathering dusk, the great house behind them was nothing more than a dark shape against the sky, its windows beginning to glow one by one as the staff lit the evening candles. It was the same house it had always been, the same stone, the same corridors, the same ancient bones, but it felt different now. It felt like a place that might, after all these years of grief and silence and careful, crushing control, finally learn how to breathe. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, and they stood like that, the two of them and the horse, as the stars came out over Wren Hollow Park. 6 months later, spring came to Wren Hollow. The parkland burst into green almost overnight, as though the estate itself had been holding its breath through the long winter, and could finally exhale, The daffodils came first, a tide of gold washing through the gardens and the orchard. Then the cherry blossom, pale pink clouds that drifted across the lawns like silk scarves caught by the wind. The river ran clear and fast, and the sound of it reached the house on quiet mornings, a gentle, constant music that had once been a reminder of death and was now gradually becoming something else. The library was transformed. Saren had spent the winter cataloging, restoring and reorganizing the collection that had fallen into neglect during the years of grief. The shelves gleamed with beeswax. The books were properly ordered for the first time in a decade. A new reading alcove had been created by the south window, with a deep cushioned seat where the morning light pooled like warm honey. It was here that Saren sat on a Tuesday morning in late April, a book open in her lap, her bare feet tucked beneath her, watching the gardens through the glass. She was larger now. The child had grown through the winter, with the same quiet, determined patience that characterized its mother, and her body had rounded and softened in ways that still surprised her when she caught her reflection in the library's tall mirrors. She was not alone in the room. Taran was at his desk, but he was not working. He was watching her. He did this often now, looking up from his papers to find her with his eyes, as though confirming to himself that she was real, that she was here, that the quiet miracle of her presence in his house had not been a dream from which he would eventually wake. He had changed in the months since the reckoning, though change was perhaps too dramatic a word for what had happened. It was more like a thaw. The ice that had encased him since Hadrian's death, the rigid, protective shell of duty and control that he had mistaken for strength, had slowly melted under the persistent warmth of a house that was learning to be a home again. The severe black coats were gone, replaced by warmer colors, deep greens and soft browns that made him look less like a monument and more like a man. He laughed now. Not often, and never loudly, but with a genuine warmth that transformed his face in ways that still startled the household staff, who had grown so accustomed to his silence that his laughter sounded to them like a foreign language. The estate had changed too. Lady Delphine's departure had been like the removal of a splinter from a wound. A new housekeeper had been engaged, a calm, kind woman named Mrs. Hewitt, recommended by the Dowager and approved by Saren. She was everything Lady Delphine had not been. Where Delphine had ruled through fear, Mrs. Hewitt led through competence and quiet respect. The staff, who had spent years walking on eggshells, began to relax. Laughter returned to the servants' hall. The cook began experimenting with new recipes. The gardener planted a row of lavender along the kitchen garden wall, and no one told him to remove it. Under her care, the household ran with a gentler rhythm that left room for conversation and kindness, and the occasional unpunished mistake. The inquiry into Dr. Emrys Colwyn had been formally overturned in January. The notice had appeared in every paper that had carried the original accusation. The grave in Brynmere had received its stone, carved with her father's name, his title, and the years of his service. Saren had stood before it on a cold February morning, Taran beside her, his hand on her arm, and she had finally allowed herself to grieve. Not the silent, compressed grief she had carried for 4 years, but a full, shaking, cleansing grief that left her empty and light, and for the first time, free. The village had welcomed her back. It had begun slowly, with a single knock on the rectory door where Saren was staying while Wrenhala was being prepared for her return. An old woman, Mrs. Perry, who had been her father's patient for 15 years. She had come with a jar of honey and tears running down her weathered face, and she had said, "He saved my life, your father. When the fever took me, I should have spoken up. I should have said something. Forgive me." After Mrs. Perry, others came. The people of Brynmere who had turned away from her father in his disgrace came now with flowers and awkward apologies, and the particular shame of communities that know they have failed one of their own. Saren received them all with the same quiet grace. She did not judge them. She understood. Fear was a powerful thing, and Lady Delphine's authority had been absolute. The marriage had been announced publicly in March. Taran had insisted on doing it himself, in person, at the quarterly assembly of the county families. He had stood before a room full of the people whose judgment he had spent his entire life trying to manage, and he had told them the truth. All of it. The secret marriage, the seamstress who was a physician's daughter, the injustice that had been done under his own roof. He had spoken without notes, without apology, without the careful diplomatic hedging that had once been his native language. Saren had stood beside him and watched the room's reaction shift from shock to disbelief to something quieter and more complicated. It had caused precisely the scandal Taryn had feared, and it had mattered precisely as little as the Dowager had predicted. The county talked, but the story, when told in full, the disgraced physician, the courageous daughter, the secret marriage, the horse, was so improbable and so moving that it won hearts faster than any society introduction could have done. Sovereign was the last piece of the restoration. The great black stallion who had been a creature of grief and fury for 18 months was now the gentlest animal on the estate. He followed Saran through the gardens with the devoted patience of a dog, his huge head nodding with each step. Old Geraint, who had cared for the horse through his worst days, had wept openly the first time he saw Sovereign nuzzle the Duchess's hand. "He has come back," Geraint had said, wiping his eyes with a rough hand. "Lord Hadrian's horse has come back to us." And now, on this spring morning, the library doors opened, and the Dowager walked in, trailed by her ancient spaniel, who promptly climbed onto the settee and fell asleep.
"You look enormous,"
the Dowager said to Saran by way of greeting. "It suits you." She turned to Taryn.
"And you look happy."
"I did not think I would live to see it." Taryn rose from his desk and kissed his mother's hand. "The midwife says it will be soon," he said. The Dowager settled into her chair. She looked around the library, at the gleaming shelves, at the sunlight, at her son and his wife, and the great horse visible through the window, standing in the garden like a sentinel. "Your father would have been proud," she said to Saren. She reached over and took the young woman's hand, and for a moment the three of them sat in a silence that was not empty, but full of the years that had brought them to this room, full of the grief that had shaped them, and the truth that had saved them. Not of the titles or the house or the fortune, of you, of what you did with his name. Saren placed her hand on her stomach and felt the child move, a strong, insistent kick that seemed to say, "I am here, I am ready, I am coming." "I did not do anything extraordinary," she said. "I simply refused to let the lie stand." The Dowager smiled. "That is the most extraordinary thing anyone can do." The Dowager settled back in her chair and took up her knitting, and the library fell into the comfortable, companionable silence of people who have nothing left to prove to one another. The clock on the mantel ticked. The spaniel snored. A bee drifted through the open window and circled lazily above the reading alcove before finding its way back out into the spring air. Outside, Sovereign raised his head and whinnied. Not the searching, grieving call that had echoed across the grounds for so many months. A different sound, full-throated, joyful, ringing across the spring air like a bell. It was the sound of an animal that had found what it was looking for. The sound carried through the open library window and filled the room, and Saren closed her eyes and listened, and she thought of her father, who had taught her that stillness was not weakness, but the deepest kind of strength. And she thought of the man at the desk who had learned to stop waiting and start choosing. And she thought of the child inside her, who would be born into a house that had been rebuilt, not on secrecy and fear, but on the quiet, unshakable foundation of a truth that had refused to stay buried.